Hello everybody and welcome to the first in a series of videos we're calling old graphics cards that are still good. And in today's video we're going to be taking a look at this, a GTX 770, but not just any GTX 770. This is the EVGA GTX 770 classified. And when most 770s were only running 2GB of VRAM, this card was packing 4GB of VRAM, which in theory should really help with modern games at a time when 2GB cards are really starting to struggle. And in addition to the extra VRAM, this card is also factory overclocked by EVGA, which means that instead of running at the reference 1046MHz base clock and 1085MHz boost clock, this card runs at 1150MHz base clock and 1202MHz boost clock. It really is up there with the very best 770s ever made, and because of this it cost about £400 when new. But I picked up this particular card for £67 delivered from CEX. So on paper it sounds great, but there are a couple of negatives to be aware of. Firstly, this card is big, and to add some context, this shot shows our EVGA 770 sat alongside a reference RX 480 card. This extra size means that you'll struggle to fit this card in most OEM cases, so be aware of this if you're thinking about picking up one of these cards. The other thing to be aware of is that this card needs a fairly beefy PSU to run it. The EVGA site states a minimum of a 600W PSU with 42 amps available on the 12V line. So whilst this card might seem cheap initially, if you don't already have a decent PSU, you'll need to factor that into your budget. With that said, let's get stuck into some benchmarks. I'll be testing this card on my Ryzen 1600 AF rig with 16GB of RAM. And whilst I acknowledge that this isn't the fastest gaming CPU out there, it'll be more than enough to keep up with this 770. So first up we've got Far Cry 5. This was launched back in 2018, so it's a couple of years old now, but it's still a good looking game and has a built-in benchmark. I tested this one on normal settings and at 1080p and it performed great. We got an average of 65 frames per second and a minimum of 57, so our 770 is off to a good start. It's also worth noting that even a slightly older game like Far Cry 5 still used 2.46GB of VRAM whilst running the benchmark. So that 4GB VRAM buffer we've got on this card is already coming in useful. Next up, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is one of the more demanding games I tested on this card. I tested this at 1080p with the medium preset and we averaged 40 frames per second on the built-in benchmark. So no 60 frames per second on this one, but playable nonetheless. This one used up a lot of our VRAM and peaked at about 3.5GB. It's also worth noting that the internal benchmark reported that this game is 100% GPU bound, so that we know that the other components in our system aren't slowing the card down at all. It's given everything it's got. Moving on, I loaded up Doom Eternal, and this is where I had my first problem with this card. I ran this one at 1080p on medium settings but found that the performance was very inconsistent. This clip demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. I'm standing still observing the action and the frame rate dropped into the low 20s, but pan the camera slightly and the frame rate can more than double. This essentially made the game unplayable on this card. My suspicion is what we're seeing is the Vulkan API used by Doom not playing nicely with our GTX 770, and this is where older AMD cards like the 7970 tend to have an advantage as they've got better support for the Vulkan API. After struggling with Doom Eternal, I moved on to Apex Legends, and thankfully this one ran a lot better. On competitive settings and at 1080p we averaged 69.5 frames per second with a 1% live 52.9 and a 0.1% live 48.7 frames per second. So this card isn't going to push a high refresh rate monitor when playing Apex Legends, but it did provide us with a very playable experience. But I'm useless at Apex Legends anyway, so my ability was much more of an issue than the graphics card was. Next up I fired up GTA 5, which is easily the oldest game I tested. I can't believe this was launched in 2013. Come on Rockstar, where's GTA 6? I love GTA Online, but equally I'd love to see a new GTA game running on a next gen engine. And with that mini rant out of the way, there's not much to say about GTA 5. At 1080p on high settings and running under DX11, our 770 averaged 71.6 frames per second with a 1% live 55.2 and 0.1% live 50.4. After finding myself spending far too long playing GTA, I moved on to Fortnite, which I ran on competitive settings at 1080p. This ran great, with an average of 182 frames per second, a 1% live 86.5 frames per second and a 0.1% live 31.2. So if you tend to spend most of your time playing Fortnite, you'll have no problems at all using this card. Next up we've got Just Cause 4, and I absolutely love this game. It's just so much fun, tethering people to spinning globes and huge gas canisters and then watching them take off never gets old. And at 1080p on medium settings our GTX 770 managed playable performance. We averaged 39.7 frames per second with a 1% low of 35.9 and a 0.1% low of 34.1 frames per second. And last but not least, we've got Wreckfest, a lesser known game but one I absolutely love. If you like driving games and you haven't played Wreckfest yet, you should really check this one out as soon as you can. It's non-stop carnage and is such a laugh. And I'm pleased to report that our GTX 770 performed great playing this game. For this one we were on mostly high settings and at 1080p, and we still averaged 89.1 frames per second with a 1% low of 62.8 and a 0.1% low of 61.3. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our benchmarks. And to conclude, the EVGA GTX 770 4GB card we've been testing managed decent performance in 7 out of the 8 games we tested. It was just Doom Eternal that it really struggled with. And by decent, I don't mean that we're hitting 60 plus frames per second in every game. Let's be realistic, this is a £67 graphics card. Instead, I mean that it managed solid playable performance in most of the games I tested, which means that it's earned the title of old graphics card that's still good. But whilst running through these tests, I did start wondering how this card would compare to its old rival, the Radeon 7970. The 7970 has less VRAM, but a better memory bus, and also better Vulkan support. Let me know in the comments below if this is something you'd like me to test. I've already got both of these cards so I could easily put a video together. Okay, and on that note, I'm going to end this video. Thanks for watching, please consider subscribing and I'll be back soon with another video.